Some stories don't begin with a bang. They begin with a quiet news alert on a phone screen, a strange headline that most people scroll past. In late 2019, that alert mentioned a mysterious pneumonia in a city many of us had never visited. Most of the world kept going. Commutes, traffic, crowded restaurants, New Year's plans. No one knew that, within months, this invisible threat would shut down borders, empty airports, and turn living rooms into offices. Hi, and welcome to Beyond the TV. Today's episode isn't just about a virus. It's about how a microscopic strand of genetic code slowed down a planet of billions, and how it fits into a much longer history of pandemics that have shaped who we are. Imagine standing on a balcony in March 2020. The streets below are silent, the air strangely clear. Somewhere, an ambulance siren cuts through the stillness. You feel a mix of fear, confusion, and something else you can't quite name. This feeling was new to us, but the story itself was not. Long before COVID-19, other pandemics had already redrawn the map of history, toppled empires, and rewritten daily life. To understand what COVID changed, we have to step back, past the lockdowns and masks, past video calls and hand sanitizer, into the long, unsettling timeline of humanity's battles with disease. Centuries before, crowded airports and global trade routes, sickness still traveled. On rats, on ships, on roads worn down by caravans and armies. In the 14th century, a plague swept across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Whole villages disappeared. Fields went untended. Bells tolled constantly. People didn't know about bacteria or viruses. They knew only that death moved from town to town like a dark storm. We call it the Black Death now. For many who lived through it, it must have felt like the end of the world. Families buried loved ones in haste. Priests, doctors, and rulers were overwhelmed. Trust in old institutions cracked, and new ideas about faith, power, and society slowly took root. Pandemics don't just take lives. They expose weaknesses, crowded cities, poor sanitation, unequal access to care. They force societies to ask, who gets help first? Who gets left behind? Far from Europe, disease traveled with conquerors. When explorers and colonizers crossed oceans, they carried invisible passengers, smallpox, measles, influenza. For indigenous peoples in the Americas, these diseases were catastrophic. Populations collapsed. Cultures were shattered, entire worlds changed in a single generation. Even without a single lab or microscope, people tried to respond. They quarantined ships, they burned infected belongings, they prayed, they blamed, they searched for meaning. Sound familiar? It should. Because when COVID-19 arrived, we repeated many of the same patterns, this time with more science, more data, and far more ways to spread both help and harm. Now jump forward to the early 20th century. The world was already bleeding from World War I. Soldiers were exhausted, hungry, and constantly on the move. Then another enemy appeared, this time a virus. It swept through crowded trenches, hospitals, ships, and cities. People coughed, collapsed, and died with terrifying speed. We remember it as the Spanish flu, though it didn't start in Spain. But history often names pandemics not for where they begin, but for who is willing, or forced, to talk about them. Newspapers were censored in many countries because of the war. Leaders feared that acknowledging the scale of the outbreak would weaken morale. So the virus spread silently, carried by trains and ships, hidden beneath patriotic slogans. Masks were debated even then. Some cities ordered people to wear them in public. Others resisted, claiming it was unnecessary, uncomfortable, or a violation of freedom. Public health collided with politics and personal belief, just as it would a century later. When the pandemic finally faded, the world tried to move on. There were no global memorials, no annual day of remembrance. The trauma was folded into the larger chaos of the era and quietly set aside. But the warning was there, written in hospital records and graveyards. A global pandemic can erupt suddenly, move faster than politics, and demand hard choices when trust is already fragile. We would forget that warning until COVID arrived to remind us. The years between the Spanish flu and COVID were not peaceful. New outbreaks kept appearing, each with its own story, its own scars. In the late 20th century, HIV emerged, not as a fast, explosive pandemic like influenza, but as a slow-burning crisis that exposed deep prejudice and inequality. Entire communities were stigmatized. Many governments reacted late or with denial. Activists had to fight not only a virus, but also shame and silence. Then came a new century. SARS appeared in 2003, spreading fear across parts of Asia and beyond. Suddenly, images of masked travelers and thermal scanners at airports entered the global imagination. The outbreak was contained, but the message was clear. In a connected world, a virus can cross continents faster than our systems can respond. MERS, H1N1, Ebola. Each one was a test. Hospitals adjusted their protocols. Scientists refined tools for tracking and sequencing viruses. Some countries strengthened their public health systems. Others assumed the worst was behind them. By the late 2000s, experts were warning that another pandemic was not a question of if, but when. Reports were written, simulations were run, emergency plans were drafted. Still, for most people, those warnings were distant, abstract. Pandemic talk belonged in movies or policy papers, not in everyday life. That illusion shattered when COVID-19 stepped onto the stage. At first, COVID-19 felt like someone else's problem. A faraway city, a cluster of cases, a story at the edge of the news cycle. Then numbers began to grow. Airports started screening passengers. Videos appeared of overwhelmed hospitals, exhausted nurses, and crowded intensive care units. Within weeks, the virus had reached every continent with people living on it. Borders closed, flights were canceled, schools and offices shut their doors. Words like lockdown, social distancing, and flatten the curve suddenly became part of everyday speech. For many, the first shock was how quickly normal routines vanished. Rush hour disappeared. City centers went quiet. Grandparents saw grandchildren through windows or phone screens. Celebrations, funerals, graduations, all moved online or vanished entirely. Governments scrambled. Some acted early and decisively. Others hesitated, torn between health advice and economic pressure. Trust became fragile. Every decision was questioned. Every delay magnified. Meanwhile, the virus followed simple rules. It spread wherever people gathered closely and without protection. It didn't care about borders, flags, or political slogans. In a sense, COVID-19 was a mirror. It reflected our strengths. Scientists collaborating across borders, communities supporting each other, and our weaknesses, inequality, misinformation, and the limits of global cooperation. For most of us, the pandemic was not only about numbers and charts, it was about rooms. The room where you worked from a laptop at the kitchen table, the room where your children tried to learn through a screen, the hospital room you hoped never to see. Some people discovered unexpected moments of quiet, no commute, more time with family, a slower pace of life. Others felt trapped, isolated, or unsafe in their own homes. Essential workers carried the heaviest load. While many stayed indoors, they went out to drive buses, stock shelves, deliver packages, care for patients. They faced the virus up close, day after day, often without the protection or pay they deserved. Hospitals became battlefields. Doctors and nurses worked impossible hours, wearing layers of protective gear, holding phones so loved ones could say goodbye through a screen. Behind every statistic was a person with a story and a circle of people left grieving. The information landscape became chaotic. Headlines raced to keep up. Social media spread facts, rumors, and conspiracies at the same speed. One post urged caution, another called it an exaggeration. Trust, always fragile in a crisis, was tested again and again. And yet, there was also resilience. Neighbors left groceries at each other's doors, musicians played from balconies, teachers improvised lessons from their living rooms. In the strangest of ways, many of us felt alone together. Then, sooner than many experts had dared to hope, a new chapter began. Vaccines. Scientists around the world worked at unprecedented speed. Decades of research on viruses and immune systems suddenly converged into something powerful. Clinical trials reported promising results. For the first time in a long while, there was a sense of cautious hope. But hope did not arrive evenly. Some countries secured millions of doses early. Others waited, watching as richer nations vaccinated their populations while frontline workers elsewhere remained unprotected. The pandemic revealed not only how connected the world is, but how unequal that connection can be. At the same time, public debate intensified. Some people embraced vaccines eagerly, seeing them as a lifeline back to normal life. Others hesitated or refused, influenced by fear, mistrust, or misinformation. Conversations at dinner tables and in group chats turned tense. Public health, once a quiet background system, became the center of political and cultural battles. Mask rules, vaccine mandates, school reopenings. Each decision felt heavy, personal, and deeply emotional. Yet, despite the disagreements, the vaccines changed the trajectory of the pandemic. They reduced severe illness and death. They allowed many societies to reopen and adapt to a new normal, even as new variants reminded us that the story was not over. So where does that leave us now? History tells us that pandemics end, but their echoes remain. The Black Death reshaped medieval societies. The Spanish flu marked a generation already scarred by war. HIV transformed how we talk about health, identity, and stigma. COVID-19 will leave its own marks. Some are visible: empty storefronts, changed cityscapes, new habits like carrying a mask or sanitizer. Others are quieter: anxiety in crowded spaces, a deeper awareness of how quickly life can change, a new understanding of which jobs and people are truly essential. We learned that science can move incredibly fast when the world chooses to invest and cooperate. We also learned that information can travel even faster than any virus. Sometimes clarifying, sometimes confusing, sometimes dividing us. The next pandemic, because there will be one, will test whether we truly absorbed these lessons or simply rushed back to our old habits and tried to forget. In the end, pandemics are not just about pathogens. They're about people, how we treat one another, how we share burdens and benefits, how we balance individual freedom with collective responsibility. The story of COVID-19 is still being written, and so is the story of how we respond to the next great crisis. Thank you for watching, and keep watching us as we explore the forces, seen and unseen, that shape our world.